Thank you, Guji, for introducing our panelists today. So as you said, we're going to discuss a little bit about and explore the role of voluntary collaborative initiatives in the context of mandatory due diligence. So it's the last panel discussion of the 2 days. So we're going to be wrapping up a little bit what have been discussed during those 2 days. Probably repeating some of the messages that we've heard, some of the key concepts, and putting them in the context of, you know, I hope how we can, work now. What can you take back to you when you're going back home, and how can you start, you know, working on what will be required in the context of mandatory due diligence, how we as amfori, but also how other organizations can help you. And so we don't have slides for today. It's for this session. It's going to be just a discussion. That's why also we have more panelists than for the other sessions. And I'm going to be encouraging all of you as well to take part, to ask questions, uncomfortable questions as well. So don't hesitate. Our panelists are here to answer your questions. So you're all aware, of course, I mean, it has been said over and over again that we are facing a regulatory tsunami with both at EU and national levels, requiring companies to conduct due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence towards the impacts that they might have. And at the same time, we're also facing a lot of voluntary initiatives are taking place, are going on. The landscape of voluntary initiatives is really growing. And so I'm going to have my first question to Marius. Marius, could you share a little bit about what makes collaboration valuable in the context of due diligence based on your experience at Migros?
Thanks for the question. Maybe for Migros, it's a Swiss retailer. We are very much based in Switzerland, so maybe some of you don't know it. We sell all products from fresh products, food products, non-food, textiles, garments, also electronic devices, so all in. And to your question, what's the value? So maybe, and also in the context of due diligence, maybe we can even go a bit further back in the past. So in 2003, Migros, with a couple of other brands and retailers, founded the Business Social Compliance Initiative under the umbrella of FTA at the time. And that was almost 10 years before the whole discussion around business and human rights, the UN guiding principles where the word of human rights due diligence was developed. No, that was already important to us to somehow collaborate. And why am I saying this? Just because it's not only the regulatory pressure that drives company or should drive company to collaboration. It's also, let's say, the strategic detail, the strategic fit that the company has, and for us it was just very vital to collaborate, even if it's not. And maybe to give more pragmatic reasons why we joined or why we founded also this initiative in the very beginning. And they are, I would say, pragmatic in the way that that one of the main reasons was the business case around it. So for us, what we did was we had our own code of conduct in the non-food area before 2003. We did our own audits, trying to convince producers to go for the audits, to join this journey, and it was really hard to do so. There was a lot of effort being put into, and the outcome was limited. when we joined with others, we noticed that it was easier to convince producers on place. We could use the synergy effects, and so that was the start of the whole initiative. And in the end, it saved money for us and efforts, time. At the same time, it was also for producers added value. It was a reduction of audits. The word that is used is audit fatigue. So it was a win-win situation that was created. And I think that is a very pragmatic value. And as amfori, we always have to keep this in mind. And when we talk about membership and I talk about how can we grow and what are the different needs in our supply chain, I think we have to always think about the business case around it as well. So that is I think one big value, important one. And the second one is the scalability. So we started as 5 companies with BSCI. Now we are over 2,500. And if you have the ground, if you have the breeding ground, the good ideas in place, scaling up is possible. And I think that's what's happening now. And we have to scale up, I think, in size, but also in the quality. That's where we have to go to. And a third very important value, I think, in joining initiatives like amfori is the know-how and the network. So just look at this room. There are plenty of people, a lot of experts present. I got to know many people during the coffee breaks. I received some LinkedIn invitations already. So I think this type of value is very important. And if you look at this round, and also the speeches we had, we were talking about grievance mechanism, we were talking about stakeholder management, unions involvement, we were talking about more drier topics like data, but which are also key, and this type of knowledge, and it's for free, so all the members here, we didn't have to pay any entrance tickets, so I think that's a huge value that is offered, and that's I think one of the big reasons why we of course join such initiatives. But there are others than amfori, of course. It's just we are here in the amfori umbrella at the moment. Yep.
Thank you, Marius. So you mentioned impact, you mentioned network, collaborative, and so indeed the complexity of, given the complexity of international value chains, it's only possible to address deep issues such as living wage, such as collective bargaining. I mean, we've heard a lot about these issues in the past 2 days. When various players are working together, are discussing around coalitions. However, isn't the process of collaborative exploration a little bit idealistic in the sense that when you have all these various players around the table and they have to reach a consensus, it can also slow down progress because they all come with their own points of view and their own history, and especially when it's based on voluntary principles, it can be very difficult to create momentum or to reach agreement between all these various players. So now I'm turning to you, Dante, because I think it would be interesting if you could share with the audience your vision of this, what you call the smart mix, especially when tangible shifts towards sustainability are required by policies and governments.
Okay, thank you very much. In the when it's described who I am, it doesn't really say that I was 6.5 years member of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights until less than a year ago. So I guess that's part of my credentials to be in this conversation. And I'm from Chile in South America, where I live actually. So a few reflections on the voluntary or a smart mix approach. The mandatory due diligence wave that is taking place in Europe and in WEOG countries only, let's say Australia, the US, Canada, and Western Europe, is not taking place anywhere else. So let's say in the other 93% of the population of the world, there is no mandatory waive. And all the rest of the world, which is the vast majority, will have to comply some way or another through the value chain if we want to do business with you. So that is one thing to mention. And there's huge power imbalance because so far this wave is being imposed, but it has not been developed based on meaningful engagement from the affected stakeholders, let's say the exporters. So it has been a top-down approach that I welcome. I think it's well intended, it's based on the standards, so that's good, but it has not really taken into consideration the other end of the chain, the other side of the chain, in terms of meaningful engagement, taking into account their perspective or our perspective, and build a coalition that includes all the chain, not just part of the chain. And it should be, in my view, a coalition that has to be holistic, comprehensive, and inclusive. And so far, that has not been the case, and I think there's a great opportunity there to get that better, straight, and improved. So that's one element that I would like to mention. The regulatory wave here is a let's say response or an indication that voluntary measures are not enough. So amfori members have been able to work in a voluntary approach. But how many companies in Europe are not members of amfori? The vast majority. So yeah, maybe you capture the big ones, but overall it's a minority, a self-selected group. So how can you bring in the non-self-selected group? That's law. And you have, let's say, a level playing field. That's the rationale of a law. Everyone to a higher level, no one below that level. That's the logic, and it makes sense. So the rationale will be for amfori members to go beyond the minimum, which is the law, and everyone else at the minimum, at least, which is the law. And that will be, let's say, the logic there. So I will just want to reflect on the other side of the chain. It's so far, I said, it's mostly a top-down approach, not really very inclusive. What's going to be the impact of the legislation in the sourcing countries, and how well represented those voices are, and what's the understanding of the local context, the local regulatory context, also the local weaknesses, because there's a lot of corruption, weak institutions, etc. So how can this wave, which is positive overall, will play actually in the local context? So I will say the coalitions should have a policy objective to enhance or improve respect for human rights, yes. Also enhance competitiveness, hopefully. Not always there's a win-win. Sometimes there's not a win-win. You need to stop to do some things, and that might cost you something. But in general, win-win should reasonably be an aim. Why not, I would say. And if the driver is not a policy objective to enhance respect for human rights and hopefully competitiveness, then it will just be a compliance approach. And I say just because that's a minimum, comply with law, let's say, but the objective should be greater than just complying with law. And in that regard, that is a conversation to have. What is the objective? How far a coalition like this would like to go, or any other coalition? And then for SMEs, I said there's a huge power imbalance. So large companies put in front of an SME a contract, and it's a contract by adherence. So you don't really negotiate a contract. You say yes or no, and if you say no, you pretty much run out of business. So you say yes always. And so that power imbalance is something that I will say should be corrected, because, let's say, will never change the local reality if this imbalance remain, and it's there. There's an absolute need to collaborate. I put those in my notes, based on listening, based on dialogue with the other end on equal basis, not from the powerful to a beneficiary, but the bigger one to an equal. And those equals, even being smaller or much smaller, should be considered to be an equal. And that, in general, doesn't seem to be the case. It could be. And I think amfori is well positioned to facilitate that dialogue at local level, at national level, at sourcing level, to bring that voice in and build a coalition that is wider and more inclusive. And I will say, without that, the implementation of policies will lack enough legitimacy, because there has to be a buy-in from all ends and all pieces of the chain. Otherwise, it will lack this minimum level of legitimacy, and it will be somehow business as usual. Big ones imposing to the small ones, developed countries to developing or emerging economies. And that has been life all the time. Let's say owners of companies vis-a-vis their workers or the unions. So a power imbalance in between, and I think that should be change. Yeah, so, and if that is not the case, this shifting or improving the power imbalance, giving voice, and building a broader coalition, it will be, in my view, business as usual. So companies will be protecting their own brand, will not really be enhancing the rights of people. It will be a compliance approach to use the legislation, comply with it, impose it to someone else, protect yourself, and forget about the potential unintended negative consequences. So the potential is huge, positive, if some elements that have not been in place so far are taken on board. And with that said, that will be my, let's say, reflection for your question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dante. So you mentioned a lot of things, a lot of good points. I think some of them will be coming back during the discussions, and I hope also that some of our panelists can give a bit more concrete examples of how we can address some of the unintended consequences that you've mentioned. So I will ask my next question to you, Seljan, because to avoid these unintended consequences, Dante, that you mentioned, well, we've seen governments, and I'm referring to the Dutch government in that case, to set a structured framework for collaboration based on inclusion and equality of all, or relatively all, the actors that should be around the table. And so, Seljan, well, you as part of the Social Economic Council of the Netherlands, you have been involved in several of the next level international business conduct agreement, as you call them. And so maybe you could share a little bit with the audience about the Dutch model of governance and what have been the key learnings from the ones you've been involved in.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline, for the question. So, Social Economic Council. For those of you who don't know about Social Economic Council, it's a public organization in the Netherlands advising Dutch government and parliament on social and economic issues. And since 2016, we are also facilitating sectoral agreements, which basically multi-stakeholder agreements joining together companies on one hand, and on the other hand, Dutch government, civil society organization, trade unions, knowledge institutions, industry associations together. And the goal is to join forces to drive positive impact in the supply chain, improve the living conditions, prevent environmental pollution and animal abuse. And the way we do it is we support companies in implementing OECD guidelines and UNGPs. And as I said, so far we've facilitated more than 9 sectoral agreements in different areas. And at the very first one of them was actually agreement for garment and textile, AGT, which started in 2016 and ended in December last year. And at the moment, the companies are actually negotiating continuation of this agreement, which we call Next Generation Agreement, but in a more European level. What we've learned from the agreement on garment and textile in its 5.5 years of existence is that it drove quite a lot of positive change. Companies, when they joined this agreement, they didn't really know a lot about the due diligence. So through the multi-stakeholder structure, together with the partners, we developed a lot of tools and guidance which helped these textile companies to understand actually in practice what due diligence means. The transparency level increased quite a lot, so a lot of companies actually fully disclosed their production locations, and this led to improvements on the ground as well. There was, because it was a multi-stakeholder agreement, of course, it was a platform for also meaningful dialogue with different stakeholders. Dialogue was not always easy, but together it was possible to implement collective positive impact projects. And another impact that we saw, that the textile and garment companies, there was a shift to more sustainable materials used in production. At the Social Economic Council, we've seen that the companies who have the most effective due diligence system, they actually incorporate a few elements that most of the companies have the same if they are really successful in this field. And some of these elements, I think, were already mentioned by the panelists in the yesterday and earlier today, but just if I can summarize, we've seen that those companies who are most successful, they have two processes. The first of all, internal processes, which means that they have really good commitment from the top management. That means that the management is aware of the risks of its company impacts, recognizes this, and takes responsibility by making resources available for making change, changing its irresponsible practices. The organizational structure is adequate, meaning that there's a environmental social governance is not on the shoulder of one person, but it's embedded throughout the whole organization. Everyone has sustainability tasks, which is related to the whole agenda, sustainability agenda of the organization. And it's regularly on the agenda of the board of directors. And it's linked to the operations of the company. That the company has adequate staff, the staff who not only knows what responsible business conduct is and contributes to it, but also makes change happen. Because some of the organizations are quite large. It's, the managers, they want to change, but not everyone is on board. So it's important that the staff actually can make this change happen in the whole organization. That there's an IT infrastructure which basically not, gathers information, but it's not only about gathering information, but it's also about acting on that information, which is very important. So these were the factors that are internal for organization, but then there's also two other factors that we consider very important for the successful due diligence. And the first one of them is about the stakeholder dialogue. And here, I mean not only the dialogue with the civil society organizations or people on the ground, which is quite important, but I'm also talking about your dialogue with your suppliers, taking time to actually invest in good relationship with your suppliers to understand, to implement projects together so that they also understand the importance of sustainability. And it's not just doing what you want them to do, but also from their side to understand why it is necessary. And lastly, the collaborative approach. We find it very incremental for effective due diligence. We've seen that when companies join forces together with other companies, with other stakeholders, they are actually, they feel pushed to do more and to realize more positive impact projects on the ground. So this would be the the 6 factors that we find very important, and I feel that amfori is also providing these options to its companies, and at SER, through the sectoral agreements, we are also helping companies with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seljan. So you mentioned top management commitment, you mentioned adequate staffing, you mentioned as well acting on the discussions, and you mentioned invest in relationships. I would really urge as well anyone from the public who has been involved in the Dutch covenants to share later on, with concrete examples how this played out for you. I think it would be very inspiring for the rest of the audience. And so clearly, systemic change can only happen when stakeholders around the table complement each other in terms of positioning in the value chain. And also in terms of the geography they relate to. Because it's been discussed and mentioned already, several times today, yesterday. It was the first question actually for the first panel of yesterday. How will this regulation impact producers on the ground, impact farmers, impact smallholders? It will. And so the question is, have they been included well enough in the process, the discussions that we have had here previous to the legislation, but that we are having now in terms of what should companies do to comply with the upcoming regulations? And so, Gert, through your work with Solidaridad, you have been as well involved in several of the Dutch covenants. So I would ask you to share a little bit about your experience being one of the non-profit stakeholders engaged in the covenants, but also why is it so important that coalition should involve those who will be most impacted by the regulations?
Okay, thank you, Caroline. For those who don't know Solidaridad, Solidaridad is an international development organization with people working in around 30 countries, working on sustainability in around 13, 14 different supply chains. So mostly working with farmers and workers on the ground, and connect that and link that with companies and others throughout the supply chain. My role in Solidaridad is that I'm our European policy advisor, so I've been actively involved in policy debates around not only the deforestation regulation, but also the corporate engagement due diligence legislation. But before that, I've been involved in quite a number of sectors within Solidaridad and worked in multi-stakeholder initiatives and with companies in a number of sectors. Coming back on your question about the governance, and I think that also adds to what Dante said. The voluntary initiatives have pros and have also limitations, and I think that is why it is really important that we have this mandatory legislation, because as Dante said, that will mean that all companies will need to work on due diligence and that there is no escape. And that was one of the weaknesses, or at least in some of the covenants. There was an escape for companies. If they thought, well, I'm not interested, they just couldn't join. And also, one limitation, certainly in several covenants, was that companies could join, sit around the table, but were not forced to really commit and to act on the ground. And a lot of things took quite some time to convince companies, but there were definitely very positive outcomes, and certainly in the one on garments and textiles, where I think, and I'm looking to Seljan, around 40–50% of the companies actually participated. Still, that's the most willing ones, and of course, the other 50% are the ones that we should really target to act. But the good thing is that there was a lot of internal learning, and for us it was sometimes amazing to see how little some of the sustainability managers of textile companies knew at all about due diligence, as if it was something new, and I think it's not. So I think there is, for all of us, still a lot of work to do to tell the message and to spread the message to a lot of companies, large and small. And also there, the legislation will definitely help because there is no escape anymore. And one thing that was, I think, really helpful was what Seljan also said, the sharing about your supply chain, your suppliers, and the fact that companies could be brought together in engaging with suppliers, in working together on improvement. That definitely helped. And avoided that companies should do it on their own. Because I think we all agree that if you want to really have impact on the ground, companies cannot do that alone, and their cooperation is needed. And as Dante said, I think one of the most important things that is often still missing is indeed engagement with civil society organizations, trade unions and stakeholders on the ground. And that is definitely one concern with the legislation coming up, combined with that the legislation is very compliance-oriented, so with a large role for contracts and a large role for audits. And if you really want to have impact on the ground, you need to engage, and I think there are serious changes needed in the legislation itself. And I think the statement presented this week by amfori and a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives in the garment sector, together with representative of producer countries, I think gives a very good overview of what is needed, which is focus more on engagement, also focus on purchasing practice of companies themselves and not on compliance and on translating it in requirements for suppliers, but also for companies to be forced to look in the mirror and think, what is it that I can do myself to engage better and to work together with my suppliers on improvement and enable them to do it. And their multi-stakeholder initiative can definitely play a role. But then again, coming back to what Dante said, it's important that it's a mix. And due diligence and mandatory due diligence can play a role in what is needed in changing the sector and in transforming sectors towards sustainability. But they are only one part of the mix. And a lot of the multi-stakeholder initiatives go far beyond what will and is likely to be required from due diligence legislation. So the legislation will set the floor, and hopefully over time the floor will be higher. But I think that the role of amfori and a lot of other multi-stakeholder initiatives will be to go far beyond that floor and set the bar higher, and hopefully then also the floor will be higher over time. That's within the supply chain, and then a lot of changes that is needed will go beyond the supply chain, and also that will also need to be part of that smart mix. So companies can play a role in working in their supply chain, first of all, to manage risks and to remediate them. But a lot of changes that are really needed go beyond the supply chain and cannot be solved by companies alone. And their companies and CSOs will need to work together with local stakeholders, including local governments, to create an operational environment where a lot of the root causes that companies cannot solve alone will need to be solved. As a first start.
So Gert has a lot more to share, apparently.
I can continue a lot more, but...
So please don't hesitate to ask him questions afterwards. So yes, addressing risks and creating impact requires businesses to adopt a mindset of active engagement in multi-stakeholder coalitions. We've heard a lot of the word pre-competitive yesterday. I think one of the speakers mentioned it 4 or 5 times. So pre-competitiveness in the way that companies engage with each other is key. It requires as well a mindset of continuous improvement and responsibility beyond their own operations, so also towards their suppliers and the suppliers of their suppliers. So now I'm turning to you, Valentina, because I would like you to help us bring the discussion back, or some clarity at least, over how companies, including SMEs, should approach this regulatory tsunami, and more specifically how we as amfori can help our members.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. Not an easy question, right? And I think a lot has already been said in those past 2 days. And maybe I will try to sort of wrap it up and make sense of the very many different things that have already been mentioned. Building on what Marius said at the very beginning, I think we are a business-led initiative. We are proud to be a business-led initiative, and our work really goes back to the early 2000, when 5 members, you said, came together and they decided that actually it did make sense to work together collaboratively on common supply chain challenges. They were not pushed to do that because there was legislation, but they thought that it did make sense, that, right? The idea of collaboration was we can create collective impact, we can create leverage. But of course, early 2000 and the situation today, I mean, quite a lot has changed, right? You mentioned, of course, the UNGPs that came into being in 2011, that have, of course, been such a pivotal change in the business and human rights space, right? That has generated much of the regulatory wave that we are talking about. Also, the expectations of stakeholders have been informed by those principles. But then we heard also from speakers yesterday and today as well that, of course, there are a lot of geopolitical tensions. So how can we, an organization that has at the core of its mission to support companies with improving the social and environmental conditions of their supply chains, how can we remain relevant? How can we be fit for purpose? How can we be future-proof? So these are all questions that I think as an organization we like to reflect upon, and I think the principle of continuous improvement was mentioned a number of times during those 2 days. We not only expect continuous improvement of our members in their relationship with their business partners, but I think also as an organization, we always try to look for opportunities to improve, right? Because due diligence is in itself something that, should always aim for improvement, always aim for evolving. And so we do this, so we always try to evolve, I think, by listening first and foremost to the needs of our members. Members are confronted with challenges, so how can we help? And that's really the logic of amfori, coming together to help, support, design tools for companies to do the job. And I'm not gonna say that we always get it right and that it is easy, but at least, that's really what we try to do. So listening to the members, first and foremost. But I think if we are serious about wanting to be part of that ecosystem that is referred to in the title of our event, it's not just about listening to our members. We also need to listen to stakeholders. We need to understand the broader picture. We need to be mindful of regulatory trends. So there is a lot that is going on beyond the amfori family, so to say. And I think as an organization, we try to capture those elements. So there is an important work that is done by amfori advocacy. I think this is what we try to do. And then it's also very much about engaging with stakeholders. And I'm looking at Dante because you sit in the Stakeholder Advisory Council. So we have decided, even if we are a business-led initiative, and I repeat that we are proud to be a business-led initiative, we see the value add of engaging with stakeholders, and we have decided to institutionalize this engagement by setting up the Stakeholder Advisory Council, just to give one example. But then, of course, we talked about local engagement. We have here network representatives from different countries. I mean, that's what also amfori does. We can bring that local dimension in the work that we do. Of course, it can always be done better. It can always be done more of it. But I think we have. I strongly believe that we have the means to really progressively get there. So on the one hand, we always look to evolve. I think we haven't remained the same since the early 2000s as an organization. But then there is one point that I believe is pretty firm in the way we do things. And that point is international standards on due diligence. They inform much of the stuff that we do at amfori. We are there to really bring solutions. So we try to operationalize with the designing of tools what those international standards on due diligence expect of companies to do. To give you just one example, we recently embarked on the revision of the BSCI system with Elif and colleagues, but also with a lot of participation from members, because we needed to understand, okay, how can we improve, how can we further our work under BSCI? There was also a very extensive stakeholder consultation process that fed into the revision of the amfori BSCI system. So again, it's not just about our way of seeing things, it's also about trying to understand what stakeholders expect of us in the way we design, for instance, our social program. We decided also, actually, just to mention, I don't know if Luc is still in the room, but we decided to embark on this revision process with the help of an external organization who has quite some extensive knowledge on responsible sourcing and the international standards on due diligence, because we wanted to be also challenged on our fundamentals. So how can we do it better? How can we strive for greater alignment with international standards? So that is one way for us to still remain relevant also in this whole regulatory debate. But then we heard it from colleagues yesterday. It's not just about social, right? It's also about environmental impacts and how maybe as a company you look at the interconnection between the two. So colleagues have been working very hard from the Green team with members to really take the environmental program, our amfori BEPI, to the next level. We heard about access to remedy. I'm looking at my colleague Charlene. She would say the other coin of due diligence, right? So important. The third pillar of the UNGP is in areas where, when we sat back with our members in, I think it was maybe February 2020, it became clear that we needed to step in, and our members were looking at amfori to somehow co-create a solution that we piloted in Vietnam, and now we're discussing scale-up strategies, and we have actually decided where to go next. So access to remedy is going to be expected of companies already because of international standards on due diligence, and then also because of legislation coming in. We talked about data yesterday. It's not going to be easy. In particular, there was a question that I thought was spot on. So how are we going to measure impacts on people? It's not an easy one, but of course we see it on an awful lot of data, and I think there is the desire, and Jaap is over there, to really try and turn those data into meaningful insights so that our members can potentially, inform their decision-making strategies. And something that wasn't mentioned, and I think we should have mentioned more, but to give credit to Raymond, I don't know where he is, and the team in capacity building, I think what amfori did from day one, from the very start, was not just agreeing on a code of conduct. I think we were members at the time already in the early 2000s were doing more than that. There was already that time capacity building. We really believed that you need to create the conditions in the factories within your suppliers and business partners for them to understand what the commitments set out in a code of conduct mean, how you can go about making sure. And of course, it's not going to be easy, but I think there is that important idea of wanting to empower actors in the supply chain, wanting to empower even your own company staff to understand what due diligence is all about. So we have a huge portfolio of capacity building trainings, and I think we will look into expanding that because we believe that that is an important component of due diligence. You talked about audits. Yes, it's not just about audits. It's also about building the capacity, building the necessary know-how. So maybe just to bring it to a close, I think we want to demonstrate as an organization through this 2-day event that collaboration does make sense, that collaboration can play an enormous role in due diligence, in supporting companies with operationalizing due diligence. There are still a lot of challenges and it's not perfect, but I think even in the context of upcoming legislation, collaboration will be needed, maybe to go beyond, like you said, Gert, to move beyond compliance. I think you need this space to sort of try out solutions. That's also what amfori is all about, the Speak for Change. I mean, let's just pilot it. Let's see if it works. Let's get feedback on how to make it better. But I also want to maybe be very clear, because sometimes when we talk about collaborative initiatives, companies, oftentimes there is this fear that companies might actually hide behind an initiative. But this is not, I think, what we are saying. This is not what we want to convey as a message. I think it's more about really scaling solutions, scaling positive impact. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Valentina. That was a very good overview of the benefits of being in a collaborative initiative such as amfori, and I'm sure there are many others. So now I'm turning to you, the audience, for your questions. Maybe also if you want to share your experience being part of collaborative initiatives. I mean, we've heard yesterday the amazing outcomes of the collaboration of Systembolaget with Unionen, the Swedish union, and the impacts that they've had on South African farmers. I think it's very inspiring to hear this kind of stories. So questions, experiences, fears maybe. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Just a quick question, Gerwin Steel from RAP, to Gert. Do you feel that purchasing practices are well covered by the German Supply Chain Act, or do you have question marks around that? Because the text seems to me very, very clear.
To be honest, I don't know the details of the German Supply Chain Act, how it worked out, so only the broad lines. I think it's better phrased there than in the European proposal. In the European proposal, it is in the recital very clear and strong wordings, but not translated into any real ask from companies in the articles itself. And I think there is a lot that can be and should be improved in the European legislation. Sorry? But yeah. So as I said, I know the European text a lot better than the German legislation. I know that it's mentioned there, but I don't know the details, to be honest. So if anyone else knows more about how it's been phrased there and what we can learn from it, please do add. But what I want to add is that I think that is absolutely a key issue to avoid also that it's being seen by suppliers in the south, as what I hear also from Dante, but also within our organization from my colleagues in the south, that the risk is that this is being perceived as, European has a great idea again, and it's being thrown at us, and we need to comply with it. It will only work if it will end up in joint engagement with with suppliers, and also in changes in the purchasing practices of the companies themselves. And I think all companies do know that this needs to happen. So I would say to companies also, don't wait until this is the legislation, but start doing it, and use initiatives where you collaborate with others as amfori to really start changing your purchasing practices and include working with your suppliers to work together on reaching living wage, etc., there's no need to wait for the legislation to make that reality. And I do hear some companies say, we are a bit in a pause now because we are waiting for legislation. Why? You know what is needed to be done.
Can I say a word? From my center that I direct in Chile, we have been working with 9 German chambers of commerce in 9 countries. And I have been doing some awareness raising. What strikes me, 50% of the members are subsidiaries of German companies. The other 50 are Latin American companies with exposure to the German market. I would say less than 10% of the participants have even heard about the German Act, much less any idea and how to implement it and the practicalities of it. Yeah, so in a raise of hands, I say, who have ever heard? Hands, and I don't go deeper to say, what have you heard? Maybe nothing, yeah, but so I think that there's a lot of work to be done on the practicality. But how I see it is that it can be a piloting, the German Act implementation, also the Norwegian Act implementation, which is more advanced than the German, more demanding, and then they too can serve as piloting for the directive to step in, because there are going to be lessons there. The German International Chamber of Commerce is involved. The German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights is involved. The German Institute for Human Rights is getting involved. So there's a learning curve there that I think it will serve very well the future implementation of the directive, because there are a number of lessons to be learned. At the very minimum, awareness, which is surprising because you would suppose that would be there already, and clearly not, and that has been my first-hand experience.
My name is Raj Nennemans. I'm owner of Fashion Power. It's a company that makes sustainable sports and outdoor wear. And I have a question for Dante, because he mentioned all initiatives now are top-bottom. But suppose it would be bottom-up. Would sustainability be a priority?
Well, I think it should be both ways. So I don't believe only in bottom-up. My perspective is both. And also the driver from the south, let's say, is aspirational sustainable development for the most enlightened business, let's say, owners or leaders. Yes, but basically the driver is trade and commerce, access and retention of market, lowering transaction cost. And if I have to retain a market, let's say Swedish Systembolaget happened with the Chilean wine industry, and that requires certain changes in my behavior, why not? But what the SME owner says normally is, I don't live out of diplomas or congratulations, I live out of contracts. So if in order to have more better contracts, I have to improve my let's say, social environmental performance, I will try to do it. And I'm not against. The thing is, if there's no market reward, and actually my neighbor that doesn't comply with anything gets the contracts because it's cheaper, then what is in it for me? I'm stupid by complying with higher standards if there's nothing better for me. But, and that's one element. So what are the drivers? But the second element, I was conducting recently a consultation in China, well, maybe 3 years ago because it was in presence, with Chinese exporters. And they said, we don't have incentive for being transparent. We don't have incentive to share our data with our clients, because every time we do that, we get squeezed further. And therefore, the productivity gains, I cannot retain them. And therefore, I never have enough to invest in improving conditions, working conditions, because every time I share, I end up feeling that I'm losing. And that's on purchasing practices, and that's a both direction dialogue that I think it should happen in order to understand the drivers, understand what are the opportunities to have a win-win situation, hopefully a win-win situation, and I think that should be, in my view, the way forward. The opportunity, as I said, is in front of us. We can surely do that, but it requires to have this attitude to listen meaningfully, and to be able to set the strategy based on the affected stakeholders listening process. Not only stakeholders, very broad, but the affected ones that are more difficult to find. It might have a slightly different perspective than the more organized stakeholders that can be, let's say, unions or federations, etc. But the ones that are less organized, smaller, and invisible very often, those are the ones that should be given voice, and we should be doing a better effort. Whoever has more power or, let's say, knowledge, to listen to their perspective and embed those viewpoints. That would be my, let's say, reaction.
Thank you, Dante. We have 5 minutes left, so time for a couple more questions, and then I will ask the speakers to wrap up.
Yeah, hi. It's not so much a question. I appreciate the conversation on purchasing practices. I'm president and co-founder of Better Buying Institute, and that's the sole focus of what we do, is hearing supplier voice about the challenges that they face in implementing any sort of sustainability goals, social or environmental, because the financial stability of their business and the business relationship's not there. And so we can help you with that. But I just want to comment, particularly on Gert's comment, I really appreciate your emphasis that we've got to see changing purchasing practices. We can't be satisfied with, oh, we've adopted a policy, we've done training, we've got people in charge of this. That's not good enough. And we need to measure the real changes in purchasing practices, because they can account for over half or 3/4 of the non-compliances that you're trying to address. So until we address purchasing practices, none of the other stuff is going to happen.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Okay, so parting words from our panel. If you want the audience to walk away with one thing that they can bring back with us, what would it be? Dante, you can start.
Yeah, I will say meaningful engagement.
Well, I would say to companies, first of all, do what you can do yourself. And then what you can't do yourself, cooperate with others. And also, and certainly when it comes to engagement on the ground, cooperate with others also beyond your supply chain. So both change your supply chain, your own supply chain, and see what you can do to focus more on root causes behind issues. Ah, you have one? Okay.
That was loud. My message would be join the different working groups at amfori, join the different councils, task force, project groups that are around. You are already here, so you are already engaged, but you can, maybe some of you, do even more, because if we have more brain power in these, working groups that work on delicate questions, we get better solutions, we get better ideas. So using more brain power would be, for the use of all of us. So join the different working groups, and also join other initiatives in your sectors.
My message would be that I think all companies, regardless of their sustainability aspirations, they have negative impact on the ground. And the way, and most of the negative impact is along the supply chain, where companies have little control or leverage. And just because you don't have leverage, it will not help you, because you need to build that leverage. That's the expectation from you. And in order for you to build that leverage, you need to collaborate with others. So being in collaborative initiatives will help you, especially if you are SME. That's not a choice for you, it's a necessity.
I'm actually gonna nearly repeat what you said, Seljan. So I think collaborative initiatives are not just a nice thing to have. I think they are necessary, and this is very true also for SMEs. So I think in the context of forthcoming mandatory due diligence, that will have an important role to play.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone.